Once upon a time, there was Insight Maker, a web-based modeling and simulation environment that made it very easy to create models and share them with other people. And because of the ease of use of the environment and the ease with which you could share models with other people, even though it was initially designed as a simulation environment primarily, we figured out how to create lots of other types of diagrams with it, in terms of mind maps and dialogue maps and causal loop diagrams and rich pictures, even though it was initially developed as a stock and flow simulation model environment. And it continued to function very well in that capacity. Though as Kumu came along and continued to develop, the question of where to develop the model became more and more murky unless it was an actual simulation model. So that if you're going to develop a stock and flow simulation model or an agent-based simulation model, and you want to develop it and readily share it with others, then Insight Maker is a very easy answer. Though if you want to develop other types of diagrams, then it becomes sort of difficult at times to figure out whether or not to use the Insight Maker environment or whether to go and do it in Kumu. Things that I used to develop in Insight Maker, I now develop in Kumu because the environment is very fluid and very conducive to doing relationship models. And I had said that a person could become operational or functional in the Kumu environment in 10 minutes or less. And when I created the initial video to explain how one created their first relationship model, it turned out to be about 1 minute and 45 seconds, so it was far less than 10 minutes. So in terms of the environment being difficult to use, it's not, and I'll show you some examples of it in a moment. So in terms of my current thoughts about when do I use Insight Maker, if I'm going to develop a causal loop diagram that's likely to evolve into a simulation model, I probably want them to both be in the same environment. So I would use Insight Maker to do the causal loop diagram. If I wanted to use the storytelling aspects of Insight Maker, which are simply marvelous, and I realize that I haven't explained how to use storytelling yet, but we'll get to that in another lecture before too long. So if I want to use the storytelling features, which allow one to develop a model and then unfold it to others so that they simply walk through it and it tells the story of the development of the relationships in that model, then Insight Maker is also a good choice, though the storytelling features of Kumu are developing rapidly, so it becomes more and more difficult to decide, do I really want to create it in Insight Maker or should I go create it in Kumu? And though if I want to actually develop this story and present it to others in a form so that they don't have to interact with Insight Maker at all, if they just want to read the story on a web page, the new article feature of Insight Maker, which is rather marvelous, which allows one to take this story that's been developed and select Publish Article, and once it goes through that article publishing process, what it turns out is a web page, an article that one can read that essentially unfolds the same way that the story did in Insight Maker. So that you can send someone this URL and they can just read through this, which unfolds the picture the same way that it did in Insight Maker. And that same thing works for simulation models, where this is a simulation model of a balancing loop with delay, which shows the result of different delay periods, turning that into the article, then unfolds it in the same way so that it describes the model and then shows the graphs. And here one can walk through this story just as though it's a web page, so that nothing really has to load. It's just text and a few ping graphics. Though if you want to develop a relationship model that's either a rich picture or a mind map or a dialogue map or systemograms, then Kumu seems to be a more apt environment to do it in. And if you want to develop a causal loop diagram that's quite elaborate, you will find the Kumu environment far more supportive than the Insight Maker environment. So that if I look at this Hawaii quality of life model that was developed some time ago, this is a causal loop diagram, though it doesn't show the causal relationships here, because you have to realize that every one of the blue elements on this map is actually a causal loop diagram, which is presented in more detail in some other map, which you can then go to and look at. And here is that loop sort of exploded. And this environment actually has the initial map that was presented. Let me get back to it here. And yet there are multiple other, there's a social and cultural map, there's a civic engagement map, and these are all interrelated, and I would simply not attempt to do this in the Insight Maker environment, because it's not fluid enough to manage something that's this elaborate. So that if you want to create something that is, extremely elaborate, or if you want to create an environment where you want to collaborate amongst a number of people and develop a model, the Kumu environment is very good for that, because it provides the ability to also have it has a comments discussion feature built into it. Here is a model that's in progress by the Hewlett Foundation about the Madison Initiative, and you look, there are associated discussions that go along with this where people are reviewing aspects of this model, and this model is unfolded in a similar storytelling mode that's done for Insight Maker model. So here's part of it and a description for it, and another part of it and a description for it. Okay. So it's a causal loop diagram that's unfolded in a story, though it's of such an elaborate nature that I wouldn't want to try and do this in Insight Maker either. And this page that I'm grabbing all these from is the Explore page on the Kumu website, and I'll post a link to this in the external references for this lecture, so you can go here and wander around and look at some of these. And this particular model, relationship model, which is what I call an e-learning map, I wouldn't want to try and do this in Insight Maker either. Well, I actually did try to do this in Insight Maker, where each one of the colored lines on here represents a learning thread, and an individual selects one and then walks through the individual components of this thread. And there are discussions associated with each one of the threads where people have comments or questions about the content and interact with the person that developed the map. Oh, that was me. So this, again, this kind of environment, this kind of a model is not something that I would try and do in Insight Maker. So I think it's important to understand what the model is that you're working on and what it is that you intend to do with it, how it's supposed to develop over time. And as I said, if it's a simulation model, then it's easy. The answer is Insight Maker. If it's some kind of a qualitative model, then the question becomes a bit more difficult. If the model is extremely elaborate, then Kumu is probably the answer. And there's currently a Creating Meaning with Kumu course available that's just like this Creating Insights with Insight Maker course. And if you go to systemswiki.org and simply select courses, it's the second one here. It's priced at the same amount. And if you haven't started following the Creating Meaning with Kumu course, people currently participating in the course are commenting very positively about the content. So hope you found this meaningful, and in terms of figuring out whether you want to do the model development in Insight Maker or in Kumu, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.